Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We don't have anything on the agenda. Did anybody have anything they wanted to add?
Hey, this is Ben. I just joined and I know I had something to add, but I can't remember it. So stall for a minute while I think.
All right. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2020. And yeah, if anybody has anything they want to add to the agenda, talk about anything related to CSI, feel free to add it to the agenda. One thing I noticed was I think somebody had been attending these meetings and only these meetings and not the Kubernetes storage SIG meetings or any of the other meetings, and got the impression that there's not a lot of work going on around CSI. I spoke to them at KubeCon, and I wanted to kind of dispel that myth. This meeting is mostly focused on the specification itself and moving that forward. The work around implementing the specification actually happens in other meetings. So there are Kubernetes CSI meetings, and there's the Kubernetes Storage Special Interest Group where a lot of the implementation work is going on. So those are very, very active. And this group moving the specification forward, actually, we're trying to keep it at a slow enough pace that we can keep up with the implementation, because that tends to take a lot longer than adding to the spec. Anyway, Ben?
So I did remember one thing that I brought this up last week at the regular Kubernetes storage SIG meeting. It was about FS freeze. So as Xing mentioned, we did discuss this like a year ago in the context of like snapshots, and there is a PR that proposes. Do we have Xing, by the way?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm here. Yeah, so let me find that PR. We could, yeah.
Yeah. So I think the part that some people might not appreciate is that FS freeze is a necessary but not sufficient part of taking consistent snapshots, and we're working on the Kubernetes side on like the quiesce mechanism for how you get the application to like be in a good state when you want to take your snapshot. But the FS freeze part of it requires elevated privileges, which means that most pods won't be able to do that inside the pod as part of their quiesce workflow. And it makes sense to me to have the either something like a kubelet do the FS freeze on behalf of the application, or to delegate it to the CSI node plugin, which already has elevated privileges and could do FS freeze. So the real challenge with all of this is how the workflow is managed, because you've got so many different moving parts, and who can talk to who is not very clear. But somehow something needs to invoke an FS freeze with elevated privileges somewhere in that quiesce application workflow. And I just wanted to suggest that the CSI node plugin might be the right place, in which case we should dust off Xing's PR and take another look at it.
Yeah, I think we discussed about that a year ago. I think at that time, it's because we also have this execution hook design coming up. And then, you know, how do we coordinate this application level execution hook and also this freeze by each drivers? I think at the end we just decided, okay, let's put this one on hold and let's get that one done first, and then we'll see if we still need this part. Because with the execution hook, you can actually also do fast system freeze.
If you have permission.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so there are examples of that. I think it was mainly, okay, first, since this execution hook can already do that, and then number two is the coordination between them. It's going to be really messy. So I think we decided to put this on temporarily on hold. So
yeah.
So how soon do we want to tackle this? Yeah, I think it's useful.
I think it was the right decision to make sure that we thought through how execution hooks might work before committing to doing this. But I think we've probably put enough time in now to realize that, yes, it could be done in the execution hook, but it's also likely that the execution hook will be in a context that doesn't have the permission to do it, and therefore an alternative implementation, either in kubelet or in a CSI node plugin, is going to make sense. And again, how it gets wired in is still TBD, and we should figure that out. We shouldn't not figure that out. But I think that the underappreciated piece of it a year ago was the elevated privileges that are required.
I think we talked about that too. And the reason that we brought up this file system freezing in CSI was because we think, okay, the plugin should already have those privileges. And of course,
Yes.
if you do execution hook, then that means whoever implement that application will have to make sure privileges are there, right? So,
well, I still have not figured out how an execution hook would call back into something like a
it can be done.
CSI
There's
node
actually an
plugin.
example. So actually, I talked to the person who is working on execution hook. So there is an example. It's not really exactly using execution hook, but it's underneath. It's using the same method. They have done this in the Valera project.
What's the name of the project?
Valera. I can put actually. Let me see. There is a link. Yeah, I actually even looked at this one a long time ago when we were doing the execution hook. There was an example of how to do that for if it's just like a Nginx, just have that pod, right? It's just like one volume. You just want to do a file system freeze. So there's an example. Let me find the example. It can be done.
Okay, yeah, I would love to. I would love to see an example of someone who's figured this out.
Yeah.
Because
but I don't think that particular example have those like RBAC, what kind of RBAC is needed. So of course those are needed, but the example is just that you can add this hook there.
Well, but that's essential because yeah, if they're just running their Nginx pod with cap sysadmin, then of course you can just do whatever quiescing you want to do and then do the FS freeze. But I'm interested in someone who's running an Nginx pod with ordinary privileges.
I don't think if it's ordinary privilege, I don't think you can do that. You do need to have the privileges run those commands, right? Because it's
right. But this should be a facility that the infrastructure provides, I think. I mean, we don't want everyone to have to run with elevated privileges.
So
we do want people to be able to connect to storage and mount storage and snapshot storage, and I think flushing file system buffers is one of those services that the Kubernetes or any CO is going to be responsible for providing, so that snapshots can be taken in a sane way. Did my audio drop? I don't hear anything.
I was just I was just thinking. Well, the example, of course, I look at that example. It doesn't. Of course, I noticed that they didn't really provide like RBAC, right? I asked him to. I asked that guy to get a more just to see more details if we want to do this completely what are needed. So definitely it is doable, right? But as you said, you do need to have those privileges.
Well, let's say for the sake of argument that we had merged your PR and there was a facility in the CSI node plugin to do FS freeze. Let's assume you had done that and assume that now somebody has a pod, an unprivileged pod, that wants to use that capability. Like, what would they do? Like, what sort of API is available where something that's trying to quiesce an application can reach back out and say, oh, by the way, I need the CSI node plugin to go do this FS freeze on my behalf? Is there even something that we can hook into to make that call back out?
So today you can actually use the kubectl exact command. You can actually do that. So that's actually underneath is the same. The execution hook is using the same type of technique underneath actually.
Kubectl exec is how you reach from outside the Kubernetes API into the Kubernetes API and into the pod to make the pod go do something. But then while that process is running, you might want to, you could have imagined like, a multi-step process where, step one, you tell the application to go do something, and step two, you maybe quiesce some other application, and then step three is the FS freeze and then step 4 is
Oh yeah, if you
snapshot.
have
So it's like,
yeah, if you have like a higher, so yeah, so the example that I have right now, it's just the FS freeze. But if it's more coordinated one, you have first you have to do a freeze your database, right? Freeze your application, do a QoS, and then you go freeze, do a file freeze of all your file systems. You literally have to call that on all the, if you have all the volumes, you have file system, all of them, then you have to call all of them. And then you take snapshots. And then
yes.
you do a file system unfreeze on all of those file systems. And then at the end, you unQoS your application, your database.
So would you
That will be, so that would be like application snapshot would be kind of doing this, all of this, right? And then, well,
so you're thinking something outside the pod or something outside the application, because the application could be multiple pods, is gonna coordinate all of this, and that the pods themselves won't need to reach back out to the node plugin to talk to them, but there'll just be some, like, what I'm trying to figure out is, okay, we can define the CSI RPCs, but nobody can talk to the CSI RPCs other than kubelet, right? Kubelet is the only one that can access those. So how do you tell kubelet,
so that
I need you to go,
piece, so that piece we still need to figure out, right? So that piece, I don't think we, since we decide not to go further, right? Since we thought, okay, the coordination is going to be kind of messy. So at that point, if it's just using execution hook, then it's easier to do this type of coordination, right? So if you have both, then I think the communication will be harder. And then we actually even specifically say that in our notes, there should be an option to turn this off. So if some application level, they just want to do the execution hook, doesn't want to use the CSI thing because the coordination is complicated.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I think we talked about that.
I just want to adjust something. Ben, you just said something that was surprising to me. You're saying the kubelet is the only one that can access or should access?
And the current design of the Kubernetes CSI implementation, the only guy that has access to that node plugin CSI socket is kubelet. Well, no one else can even see the socket.
No. Oh, no. That, as far as I understand, that's, all these sidecars
the sidecars are talking to the controller plugin. I'm talking about the node plugin.
Oh, well, okay. So in Portworx, that doesn't. Let me put it another way. In CSI, it doesn't mean, it doesn't restrict that, because you could have the controller plugin and the node plugin to be the same thing, which is. Right?
Yeah, but conceptually, the controller plugin is like a singleton or a small number in a large cluster, whereas the node plugin is running, and the controller plugin has low privilege. Typically, it doesn't need any privilege because all it's doing is talking to Kubernetes and talking to sidecars. Whereas the node plugin is running on every node with elevated privileges because it has to do things like mounting. And so the node plugin is the piece that would have to do things like FS freeze as well. And you're right, certain deployments might look different where maybe the controller portion is also running on every single node, but the only thing you can count on being there is the node plugin, and the only thing that ordinarily can talk to the node plugin is kubelet.
Yeah, I just want to, everything you said could be correct. I just want to make sure that we don't say that the kubelet is the only one that, because I could create a pod that finds the, with privileged pod that gets deployed and has access to the node plugin, to the node system, to the CSI socket, talks to it like no problem, right?
Well, okay, but I guess I would view that as a hack. Like if
it's not a hack. I mean, it's according to the deployment. If some storage system require that is completely possible, right? Where in CSI spec doesn't say only the kubelet talks. So that's what I want to make sure.
Okay.
See what I mean?
Right, but I guess what I'm thinking is, let's say we put this into CSI. Like the right way to implement it in kubelet would be to put a Kubernetes API on top of it, where kubelet is somehow involved in making that API real.
I completely, and I mean, I completely agree with that. That makes it, simple and portable and all those things,
yes.
and secure. And I'm just trying to say, like, if somebody wanted to, CSI doesn't restrict them.
You can always play games and implement cool and wild stuff, but the correct way to do it is involve kubelet and have a proper API.
Well, that's the part I'm trying to. I'm sorry to be a stickler about this thing, but the CSI spec shouldn't say only the kubelet. That's what I'm saying.
No. I'm just the CSI spec will just say this is part of the node interface, right?
Okay.
The node interface, and whoever can talk to the node interface could use this facility.
Perfect. That's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sorry to be confusing about that because I can't help but think about how Kubernetes is going to plug into this. I'm not familiar with other COs, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yep.
So then if you only talk about it from driver point of view, of course, that's only the node plugin. But people are building applications on top of this, so it can't be limited to just the node plugin. That's another application, which they should be able to build a privileged pod to do this kind of thing if needed.
So there are lots of solutions to the FS freeze problem. I guess I have my eye on what is the end all be all solution that would be ideal, which would be to have a standardized way of doing this that everyone can just take advantage of in as painless a way as possible. You're right that there's lots of short-term mechanisms for making this happen before we have the ideal
not
solution.
Not necessarily short. I do not agree that. Well, yeah, there are definitely different ways of doing things. So, and then definitely there's advantages of doing it this way, but then it's not enough if you really want to do application snapshot, right? So I think that's another angle.
Well, I thought that
consider.
I thought that all the APIs we were building were intended to be building blocks that would sit underneath something that could take an application snapshot if it wanted to.
We're talking about CSI, right? But
Yeah,
execution hook, it belongs to application. That's why actually now it belongs to SIG apps, not belong to SIG Exposure anymore.
Yeah, I don't think execution hooks have anything to do with CSI. But CSI is meant to provide the primitives that an execution hook needs to get a good, a consistent snapshot copy of an application. Like if CSI isn't providing the right things, then we need to talk about it in this meeting. And the one thing I think that we're missing right now is a generalized facility for flushing file system buffers, whether it's FS freeze or sync. That's a primitive that everyone's going to want.
I agree. I think from a user perspective, ideally we want to be able to run pods with minimal privileges as possible. Of course, if there is something that your application is doing that absolutely requires elevated privileges, it should have the ability to do so. But creating a application consistent snapshot seems like something that a lot of applications are going to want to do. And to set the bar so high to say, hey, you have to run your application with elevated privileges in order to use this functionality does not seem like a good idea to me. So if there's anything we could do to remove or to lower that bar and say, hey, your application can run with just regular privileges and still be able to use this functionality, I think it'll end up making the functionality much more useful.
Oh, but that will not be enough though. Depends on what type of application it is, right? So for some application, if we just implement this CSI level of FS and freeze, will be enough. But for the database applications, a lot of other applications is definitely not enough, right? So,
are you talking about the need to also talk to the application and quiesce it?
Of course, that will not be from CSI driver.
Right. I was gonna say.
Yeah. I'm just saying that it's I think this is useful. I'm just saying depends on your application. This might be just enough. But for other applications, this is definitely not enough.
Oh,
if you have this.
Absolutely. I think we all understand that there are applications where you need more than an FS freeze. That's why I say necessary but not sufficient to get a consistent snapshot copy of an application. But those are concerns that shouldn't. Those are issues that shouldn't concern the CSI community, right? We're trying to make the primitives that will be consumed by those higher layers that are doing those more fancy things.
Right, but we still need to consider, right? Because they will interact. We're building things that can be used by higher level applications. So we at least need to consider.
Yes.
But and things like that. Yeah.
I like the way that Saad said it. You know, I forget how Saad said it, but I agree with him.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's just like from a user perspective, looking at what it would require for me to run an application and use this functionality.
Yeah, yes. I want to be able to run an application. I want to be able to take consistent snapshots of it. How do I do that? If the answer is, well, you need elevated privileges, like that's a bad answer. If the answer is, oh, you just take advantage of this API, that's a good answer.
But that depends on the application. It's just impossible for if you are running, you do need to do the database QoS. That's not, we can't take off that at CSI level,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah,
if you just have
no one's
file
arguing with
systems,
that. No,
yeah.
no one's
So if
saying
you
you don't
have
need
file
that.
system QoS, that if that's enough for your application, then yeah, sure. Then we have this one ready. Then yeah.
Right. No. I
It's
think
good. Yeah.
I want to make it clear. Nobody wants to remove the application specific QS logic. I think the ask here is to also add in a kind of some mechanism to be able to do FS freeze without elevated privileges. So ideally, both would exist. And so depending on the application, either one can be used, both can be used. And I think you're right. The complexity of that interaction is going to be where kind of the devil is going to be, and we'll need to figure that out.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so then what are the next steps? How do we move this design forward? Because it certainly will be complicated.
Well, I mean, Xing has a PR. I mean, the mechanics of doing FS freeze are relatively simple.
Yeah, I think on the CSI
system call.
side, it's simple, on the CSI spec side. But what I don't want us to do is like throw this into the CSI spec and then we haven't really thought through how it's going to be used.
Right. Well,
I would like to see happen is kind of start on the Kubernetes side, figure out what the design's going to look like, agree on it there, and then come back here and push this PR forward.
Well, we have this new way of doing alpha level changes to CSI.
Okay.
I like the idea of kind of putting an alpha level version out there and actually trying to build a working version of this on top of that. And then, of course, if it turns out that that was the wrong thing to do, you can remove it. But I actually think that starting at the bottom and building up to the top is going to get you to the answer more quickly than starting at the Kubernetes level and trying to figure it out from there. I mean, of course, someone can just have a private fork and take Xing's PR and build it and start building on top of that and try to do a POC of something that would work. That would be another approach.
I prefer having at least some semblance of like, hey, we kind of have an idea of how we're going to use this before we throw it into the spec, even if it's just alpha.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so I guess what I'm proposing is you could build it, try it out, and then proof by example it works, then add it to the spec.
That makes sense. But do you also see kind of like, hey, let's talk through like what these interactions are going to look like first, and then move forward with alpha?
Yeah, I mean, for my own sake, I would want to know what the draft Kubernetes interface would look like, because I have little test scripts that'll go create a pod with a PVC, go put some data in it, and then go take a snapshot. And that's how I noticed this in the first place, was because my snapshots were missing the data that I was putting in the PVC, and I was like, what gives? And so as far as I'm concerned, like a kube control FS freeze would or something like that would meet my needs for a simple test script. And then of course you could figure out the more complicated versions of that you might want if you're actually trying to quiesce an application. I will say there's one thing that really worries me about doing FS freezes, which is typically when you have an application and you do an FS freeze, you really, really, really want to put a ceiling on how long the file system is frozen for. And something like Kubernetes is terrible at doing things in a timely fashion. So it does make me nervous that like something in Kubernetes will freeze the file system and then we'll be depending on Kubernetes to get around to unfreezing it in a timely manner. That gives me the willies, and I don't know how to work around that. I'll have to think about it. Maybe something just like an FS sync would be less dangerous, because FS sync, you don't have to follow it up with an un-FS sync. You just do it, walk away.
Right. Okay, so I think there's consensus on at least the problem statement and hey, let's try to tackle this. Any objection to that? Okay, so then it sounds like next steps are going to be let's have kind of a rough idea of what this might look like on the CO side. And as soon as we have that, then we can start moving forward, maybe taking 407 and converting it into something that would be an alpha extension for the CSI spec.
Is there any PR or merge PR that is doing this alpha thing?
There is no merged PR that's doing it, but there was a proof of concept that I believe James put out. And so we would need to kind of revisit that.
Yeah, it's very detailed, and Said, you sent me a link to it a couple of weeks ago. I read through it, and I was shocked at how much detail there was. So somebody really thought through, I guess James really thought through how to do alpha correctly.
Yeah. Okay, any other comments, concerns, anything anybody wants to say about this volume snapshot FS freeze discussion? Okay, then let's open it up for discussion. Anything else anybody wants to talk about? Okay, so I think we might be able to end early today then. You got 30 minutes back in your day. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll reconvene in 4 weeks, I believe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, take care, folks.
Bye.